Howdy, I'm Patrick Coble. I'm the VDI hacker, and today we're going to talk about endpoint security, which is kind of the root of the problem. A little bit about me. I am a hacker, joined the Marine Corps, did a couple tours in Iraq, but I've been a big security and EUC nerd for a long time, and I do a lot of trainings with red teams on how to break into things, and a lot of trainings with blue teams on how to defend things. And that's what we're going to talk about today: is how to defend and what are those common attack things. And I'm in my natural habitat, even though we are not on a stage right now, but I am pointing at things, which is part of the job as a V expert, as a CTP, as that community person like me. So let's talk about how they attack, right? How do people get in? What are the common cybersecurity threats that we need to deal with all the time? Number one, you're working against an estimated $1 trillion plus industry, right? There's a lot of money that can be made every day. A single attacker can make thousands of dollars a day just sending ransomware and basic phishing emails that just get you to click so that they can infect, and then you can pay them. But then phishing is also another revenue stream because you can use ransomware, but it's also for credential harvesting and to get more credentials. And when you go from that to whaling, right? So we started off with ransomware and just trying to get infected. Now we sent phishing emails trying to get credentials. And now we get into whaling where we're getting into wire fraud. And the best example of that is Facebook and Google paying over $100 million in bad purchase orders to a single individual over the course of a couple years because it took them a while to catch them. And this happens far too often. There's too many emails that happen, and people will say, hey, let me go ahead and wire that money. The CEO said so. But look at that domain name. Is that really your domain name? So let's think about how easy our lives are and how many accounts we have to keep up with. It's a lot of juggling, right? And how many passwords do you share between multiple online accounts, or maybe even your domain admin account or your domain account, right? Let's talk about that. Are they all unique? In most cases, not. And if you think that we have a bad time as IT individuals trying to keep our passwords separate, our users have the exact same struggle, right? So shared passwords are very, very common out there. And so when we talk about that, there's lots of breach and leaks that happen. And we can thank AOL back in 2004 for leaking the first and 92 million records, right? Kind of a bad day. But right now, as an attacker, every single person probably watching this right now is in at least 5 to 10 breaches. And your users' bad password habits will eventually hurt your business. And so I'm showing dehashed up there in the corner. That's what I use, and along with other offline databases. But there's 12.3 billion username and passwords that I search when I try to attack anyone, right? Doing a penetration test. And so these are a couple of those big heavy hitters, right? A lot of these are multiple millions. Some of these are breaches. Some of these are insider leaks, right? So you can't really do it. But when we talk about almost 12.4 billion, there's more username and passwords than there are people on Earth, which gives me, as a good guy attacker, a lot of things and a lot of options to be able to do it. So let's dive into that. And it's also grown by over 5 billion records just since of May of last year, which is crazy. Let's talk about the VDI side of things, right? It's kind of a monster. It's its own special thing. But let's talk about how you are. Let's do a self-assessment. What do you host in your virtual desktop deployment? I'm sure it is business critical. I'm sure it's also revenue impacting, which goes right back to business critical, right? It's got to be up. And then what kind of data is it? Is it PHI? Is it PI? Is it PCI? Is it credit cards, right? Is it intellectual property and patents? And who would want it, right? That's what you need to do when you're starting to do a threat assessment for yourself. And then let's think about the basic parts. You're publishing them a virtual desktop or an application. What can your users do in that session? In many cases, they can do a lot more than you think. And when we talk about ransomware and spreading and worms, it all comes back to SMB. Is SMB 1 and 2 and older versions of 3 turned off in your environment? Do you know if you have good NTFS permissions and share permissions? This is where a lot of this kind of comes in. And this is what usually I see when I do these presentations, when people learn that VDI just inherently is not secure by default. So what are those things? When was the last time on the VDI side that you patched your image? A month, 2 months, 3 months? In many cases, PCs are actually more up to date in most environments than the VDI. Do you restrict internet browsing in your virtual desktop? Most have unlimited or unfiltered access to that. And that's because it's in the server VLAN. It's in the data center. It's not on those client networks that your computers and endpoints are actually plugged into. And what do they have access to on that network? What file shares, what databases, what internal websites do they have, right? It's probably going to be a pretty big spread. Do you restrict application execution? Can you just launch anything? I don't know, right? Let's poll the audience here. Again, how many of you are domain admins? How many are actually updating your virtual desktop image with that account? Have you ever heard of Golden Ticket and Mimikatz and how you can use privileged accounts to gain other privileged accounts? And do you seal your image with that domain admin account? Do you restrict application execution with App Locker or other things? And do you have multi-factor enabled for your virtual desktop deployment for external access or even internal access? But have you MFA'd all the other things that your users might be logging into? Do you have a phishing or social engineering training program? So let's go real quick through a couple of the common VDI security fixes real quick, right? So number one thing is you got to have a Windows policy foundation, right? We have to have success and failure for everything that we can, even the advanced options. And we need to make sure we have good local retention of all those logs because it makes the world go round. If you don't have any logs, there's no way you can do an incident response, right? And this isn't just VDI, this is just Windows in general, right? Password policies, 20 plus remembered, 14 characters or more, and complexity turned on, right? And part of this comes back to privileged account management. This is a very common weak point is a lot of people, if you look in your domain admins group, how many people are in there? 50, 100 or more? You need to reduce that to 2 to 4. It needs to really just be service accounts. You need to have delegated admin groups that are going to allow you to make sure that if you are the Citrix admin, the VMware admin, the IGEL admin, that you can only do what you're supposed to do on that UMS server or that SQL box, right? And you can also look at PAM servers and jump servers to make that things a little bit easier. But focus is key. We don't need to boil the ocean, right? We need to make sure that we are removing admin application to access to those applications that we know the users don't need. We need to remove as many common jailbreak points. We need to lock down that desktop and start menu and that file explorer. I've always talked to this about, the Mr. T starter kit. And so the first thing you need to do when you get your virtual desktop image is you've got to optimize it. Then you've got to put those Windows policies on it. Windows doesn't secure Windows. It secures Windows the best, right? Windows patching, you got to keep up to date with it. Put it on a calendar. And now we've getting more and more jewelry. We're starting to get back to the Mr. T we know and love, right? Application whitelisting, now we're controlling what can be executed and what can't be executed. And then once we control session policies, now we're controlling what can be executed, and also what can go in and out of the session. So optimizing it, you've got a couple options right here to pick from. Citrix Optimizer, VMware, and BIS. All three of those are great options. Windows policies, here's your kind of basically the kind of top 10 of the things that I like to go through of removing those admin applications and using App Locker or some other application control solution to lock down those things. Make sure we're controlling the internet flow in and out. Remove all unnecessary things that users need to get to. And then lock down the file explorer, the start menu, control panel, and then eventually lock it down so only known good executables can ever be done, right? Can ever be executed. So you need to patch your images at least monthly, right? But don't forget about those supporting applications like Java, Adobe, and other browsers like Chrome and Firefox that you may have installed on there. You need to test and deploy, and you've got to be able to rinse and repeat, right? When we talk about whitelisting, you can turn on most application control solutions in a audit-only mode, but then you can eventually first just start limiting access to admin applications, and then you can go from there to LOL bins. You can look up that and see lots of fun stuff there and eventually get down to that last, right? So when we talk about session policies, this is what's allowed to go in and out of your policy of your virtual desktop. That is controlled by these settings, right? So we're showing Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, and AWS with both of their protocols. And if we look here, out of the box, like AWS is more secure just by nexting it. There are more things that can be turned from Microsoft, Citrix, and VMware that you can turn those knobs to make it more tailor-made to what you need to. And it also allows more flexibility for use cases. But between all these, this is kind of a good way. And the risk category over there is going to vary between there. Some people think that, audio isn't anything to worry about, but are you a healthcare site? Is a doctor doing dictation? Because if they're doing dictation, then they are definitely doing PHI across that, right? Your audio stream is something you need to secure and go from there. So the common things you need to be logging, you've got to have an AV. Lapse is another good best practice. 1Password should rule them all. You should be going for A+ on everything. You should replace those default certificates on everything too, right? We don't need those everywhere, and it's accepting a man-in-the-middle attack all the time. Worry and go through and audit your privileged accounts. Multi-factor all the things that you can. And if you can, do micro-segmentation. And then from there, do a Kerberos checkup. See if you could survive a Kerberos attack or a golden ticket attack. So what's on the endpoint field, right? What's out there, right? If users are still using an endpoint, it's still a thing that we need to worry about. If you have a VDI solution, then you have basically two main options. We've got Windows and then non-Windows, right? And when we talk about kind of the top 5 and endpoint leaders, you've got Dell, HP, IGEL, Stratodesk, and Unicon. All these are great solutions depending on where you're at. Obviously, we'll talk more about IGEL and really dive down to why it's better, especially on the security front. And when we talk about security front, this is kind of a big part of it too, right? This is going to tell you how flexible the solution is. And if we look at this list here, IGEL has all types of options for different database hosting, along with where you can run that UMS server. It's not just Windows. There are benefits to that, right? There's different attack surface differences between running something on a Windows box versus that. And so you can kind of look and go through that list of some of the options. This can really help you out. And this chart kind of just summarizes it in a bigger view, right, of what database types does it support. And if we look, IGEL is the most compatible with your database providers out there, which is great. Management access is great too between these. But, we've got a web console from Dell. We have kind of an MMC console through HP. IGEL, we've got the Java and Windows console, but we also have some REST APIs and other things coming. Stratodesk is web plus some scripting, and then Unicon is all web, right? So when we talk about picking a good endpoint, is we also need to think about, look down here at the very bottom here, is that Windows and Linux are at version 2004 is the newest Windows release, and kernel version 5.8.7. And then look at the Citrix clients and the VMware clients that are newest for each one of those endpoints. Then just look a little bit above that to IGEL. IGEL has the most up-to-date clients. When we talk about security, functionality, and how the thing works, IGEL is going to be the best solution when it comes to that. So highly, highly recommend it. And if you look at some of these have very old ones, or it's kind of top secret. I don't really like that. I like to be able to look at release notes and know what's in the bundle, right? IGEL has amazing release notes that you probably are used to that will tell you all kinds of great stuff that you didn't know. So when we talk about picking that non-Windows endpoint, you want a solution that's secure by design. You don't want something that you have to turn all the security features on, right? You want a solution that can be hosted on an operating system that you're familiar with. Maybe you're a big Linux shop and Unix shop. So it hosting on there, you're probably more secure and more familiar and will do more updates and better, hygiene of it if it's Linux. And you have that option, whereas some of the other providers, pretty much all of them, don't have that option, right? And you want a solution that has console flexibility on where you can run it and how you can run it, especially when we talk about APIs, right? We need to be able to do things with our endpoints. We need to be able to run reports. We need to go what's going on there, right? And then client support needs to be tight. And when we talk about that, we're talking about that we need to make sure that their number one goal as a non-Windows endpoint provider is making sure that it's compatible with the latest versions of that, the latest versions of Windows or Linux, and then the latest clients. So IGEL is focused on that, which is what drives me to them being that kind of that best solution. And you need to see that there's regular updates to that OS, right? You don't want someone that hasn't updated that OS in months, right? When we think about all the vulnerabilities that we talked about at the beginning, that only makes this problem worse and worse and worse, right? So we need regular updates. So Windows versus Linux, right? IGEL, between there, we've got a little bit more ports between there, but definitely the winner because people aren't scanning for these high ports by default, right? 135 and 445 is where we identify and fingerprint Windows, right? So that's your port exposure difference. Then with patching is at least monthly, if not at least 2 random things that come out and at least probably 4 criticals that come out every year. So you're doing around 20 updates a year for all your Windows endpoints. Versus IGEL, we're doing at least just quarterly. Now, there may be other releases that you might have to jump to, but it's almost just kind of a minimum for, which is great, and that's why it's a winner against there. And then your core programs, right? When we talk about our endpoint, it's not just Windows in many cases. We still have to have all these other things on the endpoint. Whereas if we just keep the firmware up to date, IGEL packages all those other applications in the single firmware. Many of the other providers like Dell don't do that. You have to update the Horizon client and Citrix client, in some cases completely separate outside of the image, especially if you want to be on the latest one. And you may need to be on the latest one for the thing to work the way you need it to, right? So definitely the winner there. So what do I also love about like IGEL when we talk about security? We just talked about the endpoint. Let's talk about that management console. Let's dive a little deeper. It's highly available, unlike many others, right? It's extremely role-based access, right? And all the securities are in there, which is awesome. Integrated VNC with port obfuscation to kind of change the ports. So it's not just 5900, right? But we also have secure VNC with a TLS party, right? So that means that we can make sure that it's secure, and we actually put IP table firewall rules on the endpoint, so only UMS can do that secure VNC, which is awesome. It has a kiosk browser, which is really powerful depending on your use case, and I've seen it used in so many ways. That is also kind of a good way if you're publishing a virtual desktop. You might need a way that people can reset their passwords depending on your authentication provider and how you've set things up. And we're also, another thing that all the others really don't get into that much is that we're able to disable unused features. If there's features that you don't need in IGEL, you can turn them off. You know, if you don't need printing locally, you can turn those other things off. Like one of their big partners like Printer Logic and things like that. If you don't need the browser, you can disable the browser. If you don't need this, you can turn these off. And this goes back to that virtual desktop. When we talk about optimizing that image, that's securing the image, because we're removing things that we don't need, right? I don't think everybody in the corporate world needs Candy Crush on their Windows 10 desktop. Usually, I mean, I know I like it every now and then. It's really fun, but you know, it kind of goes into there. So, and then if you know how to bash script, if you're already kind of a Linux nerd, you're going to love it because you can do almost anything with their configuration profiles. The sky's the limit. The customization is almost unlimited compared to the others. You have no scripting, no other things you can do. If they don't put it in the firmware, you can't do it, which is what I like about IGEL. And then the biggest thing that I've seen just massive success for is just conversion of existing PCs and the compatibility and the success rate that IGEL has compared to many others, along with some of them that can't even do it still. And so it can definitely speed up the process because we don't have to actually go buy endpoints. We just use that next-gen OS and we just blast it on there. It's great. So when we talk about the configs, right? Profiles, that's the configurations. That's what VDI we're going to connect to. The devices are the devices folder. So profiles are kind of like group policies. Devices are like the OU where your computer's at. And that's going to control, and you can control what policies that folder is going to get, which is awesome. Your files is where you're going to do your SSO configurations, your SSL configurations, and things like that. Your background, your screensaver, and stuff like that will go under files. Your firmware is either going to be LX or OS, depending on if you have IGEL branded thin clients or if you've converted PCs or other thin clients to IGEL. And then firmware's customizations can also come into play of, because usually it's kind of backgroundy. But the console layout is just awesome, right? It's very organized. You can look at what you've got. You can see the counts. And my favorite thing about this whole part is that inside here, I can configure security for every one of those folders to make sure my service desk can do exactly what they need, nothing more, nothing less, which is great. And many others, you just give them access and they can just shut down all the things or delete all the things. There's kind of no in between. So I'm really, really impressed with what IGEL and UMS and the security that they've done. And that's secure by design instead of the other way around, which is like locking it down. I finished up a couple minutes early because I kind of went ramming speed. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you have users that all they're doing is just connecting to a virtual desktop, then you just need to go ahead and make sure you're just put them on a non-Windows endpoint. And the best non-Windows endpoint, especially when it comes from a hacker like me, security wise, is that IGEL Edge OS, especially for compatibility and conversion. So don't patch twice. Don't patch that Windows endpoint for them just to connect to another Windows endpoint in your virtual desktop deployment. Make sure and do that. I know I went through a lot of this fast, but I hope you had a great day and a great IGEL Disrupt. Thank you for having me, and I hope you learned something. And you might have to pause or rewind, and that's okay. And just let me know if you need anything. You can reach out to me on Twitter or World of EUC, Slack channels, and many other Slack locations. I'm all over the place, or even in the IGEL Slack community. So if you're on the IGEL community, you've got some questions about this presentation or some ideas or my thoughts, just shoot me a message, and I'll see you there. And y'all have a great rest of the day, and hopefully have a great weekend too. Thank you so much. And you gotta have a baby Yoda, right? Come on, the child, kind of big deal. Thank you so much. Have a great day.